The following presentation is brought to you without commercial interruption by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. When you can't make it out to Gettysburg, we want to bring Gettysburg to you, and we can only do that with more support from our listeners. So please, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, where you will find our premium content made exclusively for our patrons. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It's good to have you all here again. Thank you for braving the frigid weather to make your way to the Gettysburg National Military Park Museum and Visitor Center for the next installment in our winter lecture series. I want to thank, as always, the Gettysburg Foundation for their support of this program. And I'm especially pleased today to be able to welcome our first guest lecturer as part of the winter lecture series, and that's Dr. Zachary Fry. Dr. Fry received his PhD from The Ohio State University in 2017. He then spent a year as an assistant professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He is currently an assistant professor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He has published extensively on the American Civil War and Civil War era, with articles in Civil War History, Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, among others. And in 2020, Dr. Fry published A Republic in the Ranks, Loyalty and Dissent in the Army of the Potomac, which is available in our bookstore, and I highly recommend it. It's a groundbreaking work which shed new light on the political activity of the rank and file in the Army of the Potomac. It is a pleasure to be able to have him here today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Zachary Fry. Thank you.
All right. Is everything good on the mic? Can everybody hear me? Good. All right. Well, good afternoon. As Chris said, thank you for coming out, and thank you to the park for having me. Thank you to the foundation for the opportunity this afternoon to talk to you about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is the Army of the Potomac, the Army that fought here at Gettysburg. And fortunately, you folks have the enviable opportunity to talk or listen to a topic that we definitely haven't had enough of in the past couple of years, and that is partisan politics. But at least it's partisan politics aged 160 years or so, so it'll hopefully be a little bit novel. And by the way, my wife and 17-month-old daughter are in the back, so my 17-month-old is under strict instructions to be exceedingly quiet. And if she breaks that rule, she'll be whisked out of here in a hurry. And I resisted the temptation to hide Elmo or Cookie Monster in the corner of the slide presentation so that you would hear her say "Dada" right in the middle of it. Because Dada is everything. That's every word right now. Anyway, so thank you for the opportunity to talk here today. Among the most famous units in the Army of the Potomac was Captain Hubert Dilger's Battery I, 1st Ohio Light Artillery. By the late summer of 1863, the men of Dilger's battery had risked death, slowing Jackson's surprise attack at Chancellorsville, where, of course, Dilger would earn the Medal of Honor, and, of course, performed rather brilliantly here on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. In both instances, they had stood out as examples of artillerymen who could fight toe-to-toe with the Confederates, buy time for the Union Army, and really perform very brilliantly. Not surprising, of course, since they were Buckeyes. Had they been a Michigan battery, it might be a little bit different story. As you can tell, I'm going with, offend as many people in the audience as you can as I talk here today. Dilger's 12-pound Napoleons were maybe the most effective battery in the Union Army, certainly the most effective in the 11th Corps. And many of you know this. What you don't know, I suppose, or I suspect most of you don't, is that on August 27th, 1863, less than 2 months after their trial by fire here at Gettysburg, Dilger and the men of his battery publicly expressed a desire to turn their canister fire on Northerners back home. Resolved, the men of Battery I, stated that no duty would be more acceptable to us than that of punishing the cowardly enemies in our rear. But as this privilege is denied to us, we demand as part fulfillment of the promise of sympathy and succor made to us by the homestayers that these traitors be summarily quenched and our attention left undivided to their brethren in front. In fact, Dilger's battery was only one of dozens and dozens of Army of the Potomac units to threaten their fellow countrymen this way over the course of 1863. What could possibly have caused such a frightening response from soldiers at the front? Well, the answer, of course, is politics. And that's the story that I aim to tell you here this afternoon. Political divides were evident within the Army as well. And that's another story that I'd like to highlight. Not just the story of soldiers looking askance at the home front and being frightened at the appearance of anti-war protesters at home, but the internal political machinations within the Army of the Potomac that made this army so difficult to command for a man like George Gordon Meade, and such a political liability, oftentimes, for President Abraham Lincoln. Since we're here at Gettysburg, let me highlight a couple examples of extremely heartfelt political sentiment on the part of a couple subordinate commanders in the Army. Both brigade commanders from the 5th Corps. Both men led their troops in the fight to save the Union left near Little Round Top on July 2nd. Now, Colonel James Clay Rice did not wake up a brigade commander on July 2nd, 1863. But by about 6 o'clock in the evening on July 2nd, as you all know, I'm sure, the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 5th Corps was engaged in a death grip with the Confederates at Little Round Top. And the brigade's commander, Colonel Strong Vincent, fell mortally wounded. James Rice of the 44th New York assumed command of the brigade and performed very well on Little Round Top. Well, Rice was an unapologetic supporter of Abraham Lincoln and of Republican policies. In February of this same year, 1863, he had taken the extraordinary step of writing directly to President Lincoln to express his and the Army's, he said, support for the controversial Emancipation Proclamation, which had gone into effect on January 1st, 1863. God's object in this war is the destruction of slavery, Rice wrote. You, Lincoln, are the honored instrument in accomplishing his purposes. He rules the hearts of this army. He rules the hearts of the people. Lead on as you have led. The army will sustain, the people will follow, and God will guide you. That's James C. Rice of the 44th New York. Another brigade commander who helped secure Little Round Top was Colonel William Buck Mccandless, as he was called. Buck Mccandless led his Pennsylvania reserves down the northern shoulder of the hill as the last Confederate attack sort of boiled out of the wheat field around sunset on July 2nd. Unlike James Rice, who was fighting on the other side of the hill, Mccandless was a defiant Democrat, a man who despised what the anti-slavery forces had done, he thought, to the Northern War effort. He left the Army of the Potomac in the summer of 1864 and sent a message to the Secretary of War making his perspective clear. And dozens of Northern newspapers of a Democratic stripe, because back then newspapers were pretty much just party agents. There wasn't really any such thing as a non-biased newspaper. But lots and lots of newspapers who didn't like the Lincoln administration published portions of Mccandless's letter to the Secretary of War, in which Mccandless refused a brigadier general's star. When those who administer this government re-adopt the original intention of prosecuting this war for the restoration of the Union, I, together with hundreds of officers and thousands of men at present out of service, will be found ready and willing to return. So that's Buck Mccandless of the Pennsylvania Reserves. Well, the mid-19th century political process was raucous, corrupt, and intensely partisan. The officers and men in the Union Army capitalized on that process. They came from that process, and they capitalized on it, using newspapers and voting to set the terms of debate in the North during a time of war. They published opinion pieces relentlessly, argued policy with those at home in the public eye, argued with each other in the public eye, and then, of course, the Army voted overwhelmingly for Abraham Lincoln in the all-important 1864 presidential election. So that's all really cool and it's all really important, but add to that the fact that this army, the Army of the Potomac, had been George McClellan's army. George McClellan, who would run against Lincoln in 1864, and you get an even more interesting case study in wartime politics and civil-military relations. So my talk this afternoon is sort of a glimpse into this story of politically aware young men having to navigate what I call the channels of loyalty and dissent. In the case of Republicans in the ranks, men answering to a largely Democratic, big D Democratic high command because of George McClellan and his legacy in the high command of the Union Army. And then Democrats in the Army, including those in high command, answering to a Republican administration in Washington. So, the basic differences in the big political parties of the day revolved around a couple key issues. Well, obviously, the big one was slavery. The Republican Party was a relatively new party. They had been wildly successful in the 1860 elections after fears of a slave power gripped Northern voters that year. And when it came to fight the Civil War, Republicans didn't see this impermeable line between the military and the political process. Republicans thought soldiers should actively participate in defining what political loyalty meant in a time of civil war, in a time of rebellion. They viewed soldiers then as the guardians of civic virtue. So that was the Republican perspective when it came time to fight the Civil War. Democrats, on the other hand, tended to apply their devotion to the Constitution. The Constitution is the highest moral end in and of itself. They did see a wall between the military and politics, generally speaking. They didn't like political interference in the army. And they viewed the war largely as the result of fanaticism on both sides. Fanaticism on the part of anti-slavery politicians and agitators, and fanaticism on the part of Southern fire eaters. So many Northern Democrats who went into the Union Army believed that this war needed to be fought just long enough to bring the two sections back together in a way that wouldn't jeopardize long-term mistrust and all of that. Now, Democrats made significant headway in the midterm elections of 1862, largely because Union armies had not been terribly successful here in the East, and because the Lincoln administration and Republicans in Congress were inching toward emancipation, which was proving to be less than totally popular in parts of the North. So the most strident Democrats, and the ones I'll talk about here today, were, of course, the extreme anti-war wing of the Democratic Party, known as the Copperheads. Politicians such as Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, whose views in the eyes of the Army amounted pretty much to treason. George McClellan's legacy casts a long shadow over the Army of the Potomac. And much of the debate over the war's political questions used Little Mac as a proxy for these bigger issues. McClellan himself was deeply political and relentlessly ambitious. Now, I won't talk too much about McClellan's personality here. I think that would be best suited for a different talk. But I would like to highlight a few key moments in the political story of the Army of the Potomac, and McClellan will never be far from our view as we look at these episodes. So the war hadn't gone well for Union forces in the East in 1862 when McClellan was commander of the Army of the Potomac. The young Army of the Potomac had been trounced outside Richmond, and McClellan, although he defeated Lee narrowly in a tactical and even strategic sense at Antietam, it hadn't been the sort of knockout blow that the Lincoln administration and many Republicans had really wanted. So Lincoln reluctantly fired McClellan after the midterm elections of 1862. And it was a moment of grave political importance for the American Republic because the nation's Republican leader, Abraham Lincoln, was firing one of the most dynamic and popular and charismatic Democrats in the country, George McClellan. One friend of McClellan's, an irascible general named Andrew Humphreys, who made a name for himself commanding a division down on the Emmitsburg Road here at Gettysburg, shouted supposedly during McClellan's farewell review in November 1862 that the Army of the Potomac should turn around, march on Washington, and throw the Republicans into the Potomac River. If you read soldiers' letters home in the autumn of 1862, you can almost see the tears flowing down the cheeks when they had to say goodbye to their beloved Army commander, George McClellan. So speaking of letters, when I started this project, looking at the political story of the Army of the Potomac, especially from the lower ranks perspective, there's been a lot written about the commanders of the Army of the Potomac, at the corps level and above especially, how political they were, and that's not surprising, right? Big personalities, big commanders, big political connections and ambitions. But for the subordinate officer class and the lower ranks, it's a little bit trickier to track down sources. And I think one of the main problems that Civil War historians have had when we look at questions having to do with the common soldier is that we've all been basically looking at the same several hundred letter collections or published diaries, regimental histories, and so forth. So what I tried to do was break out of that paradigm a little bit and find some new sources. And what I ended up settling on more than anything else were really three types of sources, and you can see them up there on the screen. Some of the most underused and undervalued sources, first of all, I think, lie in state archives at places like Albany and Harrisburg and Columbus, which house all of the letters between the Army's junior officers and state governors who awarded commissions. So those are all housed in collections that are sort of boringly called the Adjutant General's Papers. Don't get a lot of press, probably. Don't get a lot of people coming in there looking through them, but my God, they're a gold mine when it comes to politics, because all the soldiers writing to the governor about why this guy should be promoted and that guy shouldn't are talking about politics. So that was a real gold mine. Writing to Governor Curtin, you see there on the left, the soldier's friend, the Republican governor of Pennsylvania. Or Horatio Seymour, who you see above him there, the sort of anti-administration mainline Democrat governor of New York. Very different story when you read the letters sent to him. So the letters to governors, that was one category that I tried to look at. Another one were soldier voting returns. The soldiers voted during the Civil War. Now, not every state, and we could talk about this later on if you wanted to, but not every state allowed their soldiers to vote at the front for various sort of state constitutional technicalities. Most of the time that had to do with Democrats in the state legislatures saying they didn't want soldiers voting because they were afraid that all the Republicans had gone to war. So they found state constitutional technicalities like you had to reside in the state for the past 6 months to be eligible to vote. Well, you're serving at the front, sorry. Eventually, the groundswell of anger over that started to change the voting laws. So that by 1863 and certainly by 1864, most northern states, not all, but most northern states allowed their soldiers at the front to vote in elections. And the soldiers paid meticulous attention to the records. They kept the records, sometimes they published the records, and you can generally find these if you're willing to look hard enough. And then lastly, the other thing that I think has really been underutilized by historians is the tremendous volume of letters that soldiers wrote to newspapers back home. Soldiers were aware of the fact that newspapers were anxious for stuff to publish from the front. Excuse me. And the soldiers capitalized on that by writing about the war for readers back home. And usually it started with just sort of innocuous, sort of pedestrian detail about what life was like in the camps in 1861 or so. But as the war went on, these letters took on an increasingly political tone until by 1863, as I'll show you in a minute here, that reached fever pitch when it came to soldiers writing about politics. So these are sort of the three things, the three categories of sources that I tried to look at, beyond just the traditional, soldiers' letter collections back home and regimental histories and that sort of thing. Not to denigrate those, I just wanted to try to stretch the source base a little bit. So one of the things I found was that officers carried a tremendously important role in guiding their soldiers, goading their soldiers, sometimes intimidating their soldiers into political activity. The officers were generally a little bit older, generally a little bit better educated if you look at the demographic records. So they were generally the ones who came into the Army with their political ideals sort of settled. They had the world figured out, whether it was Republican or Democrat or something else entirely. They generally had the world figured out. And whether it was because soldiers loved them, which did happen, or soldiers learned to despise them, which definitely happened a lot, the officers' opinions and political actions carried significant weight. So the main characters in this political tale of the Army of the Potomac, I think, are really the subordinate officers, the lieutenants, captains, majors, and colonels, who interacted the most with the common soldiers and who tried to guide their soldiers into thinking politically as the war went on. Now, let me give you a few examples of just how political the Army could be. Number one, I think the most important episode in the entire war as far as looking at political activity on the part of soldiers is concerned is this campaign, this public campaign that soldiers wage, a war of words against the Copperheads, the anti-war, anti-emancipation, anti-draft Democrats back home. And it happens in the spring of 1863. So just to give a little bit of context, the setbacks for Republicans in the fall of 1862 brought a lot of Democrats into the political process throughout the North, especially in the state legislatures. And some of the more brazen anti-war Democrats, the Copperheads, secured influence in the legislatures of states like Illinois and Indiana and New Jersey, to name a few. And those state legislatures started drafting proclamations essentially saying that this war was a failure, or at least that the Lincoln administration's conduct of this war was a failure, and it was time to change course.
So as soon as the Copperheads made headway in several states, Union soldiers decided to raise their voices against them. And this all started based on sort of how I was able to piece together and track it down. As far as I can tell, it all started, at least in the Army of the Potomac, in mid to late February of 1863, in the camps of the 11th Corps, right outside Stafford Courthouse in Virginia. Okay, we're talking about after the Fredericksburg campaign, just after the Mud March debacle that Ambrose Burnside had attempted to launch against the Army of Northern Virginia in January 1863. That's the period we're talking about, this period of just total disappointment and disillusionment almost on the part of Union soldiers. But some officers in the 11th Corps get together and draft resolutions of protest against what the Democratic Party, or at least the Copperhead wing of it, is doing to the country. And then soldiers from Illinois, soldiers from Indiana and New Jersey drafted resolutions from their regimental camps denouncing their own state legislatures. Think about that for a minute. Soldiers in camp were drafting, formally publishing resolutions protesting their own politicians back home. And the fire eventually spread to every corner of the Army of the Potomac in Stafford County, Virginia, with officers usually writing the documents before reading them to the soldiers on the parade ground. And the typical process by which regiments adopted these resolutions went like this. The junior officers would get together at regimental headquarters and write down these resolutions using all the purple prose of the mid-19th century that you would expect, right? Words that we have to get out of the dictionary for now. But they would sit down and they would draft these resolutions, calling on family members and friends to shun Democrats at home, frequently saying they had more respect for Confederate soldiers than they did for anti-war protesters back north. As the first Delaware put it, delightfully euphemistic, the Copperheads were destitute of the essential elements of manhood. So officers drafted the documents together at regimental headquarters, and then they would bring the regiments up on parade. That's step 2. Assemble the enlisted men to hear the resolutions out loud and take a vote on whether the regiment agrees with these resolutions or not. Typically, they would keep their arms in camp. They would not carry their muskets to this sort of parade drill, you might call it, to keep the appearances of democracy, at least as much as you could in the Army. So they would ask if anyone in the ranks disagreed with the sentiments, and this was more or less a way of announcing what political loyalty meant and challenging any anti-war Democrats, such as there may have been in the ranks of the Army of the Potomac, to make their case known. And then, once those resolutions were adopted, they would be sent back home to newspapers, big and small, throughout the North. So you would see them in a small-town newspaper in northern Pennsylvania, and you would see them in the New York Times. We can no longer keep silent, the officers of the 44th New York declared. The men felt called to proclaim what true loyalty was and to refute that there was any hint of dissatisfaction with the war effort in the ranks. And as the men of the 14th Connecticut remembered, the proportion of anti-Lincoln men to the whole army isn't greater than that of Judas Iscariot to the other disciples. Many resolutions spoke in religious terms about the war. They called it the Unholy Rebellion. And one, which you can see up here, the 149th Pennsylvania, which, of course, fought on McPherson's Ridge on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, said, "We recognize the fearful struggle our country is now engaged in as a struggle of freedom against slavery, right against wrong, of God against Satan." They vowed practically unconditional obedience to the Lincoln administration and whatever policies it and the Congress saw fit to pass. The Iron Brigade, in one of the few brigade-level resolutions, declared that it would uphold Lincoln in all acts or measures having for their object a vigorous prosecution of the war. And the 8th Ohio said, "We ask every good and true American to sustain the man at the helm." Now, my favorite of these is from the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves, which had just been detached from the Army of the Potomac, but I'm going to call them Army of the Potomac anyway. They said, "The only right we grant to traitors is the right to die." Pretty blunt language. Especially for the mid-19th century, like I said. So, here's a complete list of the resolutions that I managed to track down. Now, historians have known about these for a while, but generally only about a dozen or 15 resolutions. I tracked down about 60 from the Army of the Potomac, which indicates to me that this is an army-wide effort. There's some organization here. Now, I've never quite found the smoking gun that says that the commander of the Army of the Potomac in this period, Joseph Hooker, who was sort of a friend of the radical Republicans, whether he had any hand in starting this or in making it happen, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that he did. And these resolutions represent pretty much every corps, well, they do represent every single corps in the Union Army, camped north of Fredericksburg, Virginia. So if you see your favorite regiment on the list, talk to me afterward. We can talk about what your regiment said. So that's the spring of 1863. These resolutions splashed across the front pages of newspapers around the North, mostly in March and April of 1863. And they definitely were a boon to Republicans in state legislatures and governors' mansions around the North. The next episode I'd like to discuss a little bit happens in the fall of 1863. Now, as you know, some stuff happens between the spring and fall of 1863, but we don't have time to get into that. So we're going to look at the September 1863 period. So right after the Battle of Gettysburg, when the Army of the Potomac, George Meade's army, and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia are sort of chasing each other around Northern Virginia, trying to come to blows. But they're both really licking their wounds after this bloodbath at Gettysburg here, and sort of tepid about bringing on a full-on battle. There are definitely a couple flare-ups, like the Battle of Bristoe Station in October, but for the most part, it's a lot of chasing the other army back and forth across Northern Virginia. It's also a period of intense political debate. And it all started, in this case, with an episode in the Army's story called the McClellan Testimonial. Now, many of you have worked in an office where folks will circulate like a get well card or a birthday card or something like that, and you sign your name, you write something witty maybe, and you pass it on to the next person to do the same, and then they send it to the person who's sick or the person whose birthday it is. Well, picture that, but on steroids. In mid-September 1863, several officers at Army of the Potomac headquarters, and we're talking here about George Gordon Meade, the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, John Sedgwick, commanding 6th Corps, George Sykes, commanding the 5th Corps, and Henry Hunt, who was chief of artillery for the Army of the Potomac. They were talking around headquarters, and they decided that it would be a good idea, at least for the sake of the Army and its relationship with its one-time commander, to implement a testimonial to George McClellan. Now, this is in September of 1863, 10 months after McClellan had been dismissed as commander of the Army of the Potomac. So this is going to be controversial. And the reason we know so much about the inner workings of this effort is actually because George McClellan had something of a personal agent, almost a mole within the Army of the Potomac. His younger brother, Arthur McClellan, was a staff officer at 6th Corps headquarters. with John Sedgwick. So there's Arthur on the right, sitting in the chair there, looking devious as always. That's McClellan's younger brother, serving at 6th Corps headquarters. And Arthur McClellan wrote a bunch of great letters to his brother all about this stuff. And for whatever reason, George McClellan's personal papers in the Library of Congress include those letters. I probably would have burned those letters if I were McClellan, because this ended up being a really, really controversial thing. But Arthur McClellan's papers or letters are there in his brother's papers, and so I took advantage of them. So George Meade apparently said, according to Arthur McClellan, that he wanted to keep this whole thing secret until it was really a fait accompli, because he didn't want the newspaper editors to lose their mind over it. Oops. So this was all an act to show that, as you can see there, the warm feelings which McClellan has ever borne towards the Army is fully reciprocated by both officers and men. And the idea was that they would draft this circular at headquarters and distribute it to all the various regiments of the Army. And you can find an original copy of this circular in the papers of David Bell Birney up at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle. So Birney kept his copy of it. And you can see, basically it asks major generals to contribute $20, brigadier generals $10, all the way down the chain of command, so that the rank and file would each contribute 10 cents or thereabouts. Okay? Again, not something totally out of the ordinary as far as like general office protocol might be. But if you add it all up, if you add up all the money that would have come from the Army of the Potomac, such as its strength allowed at this time in its history, that would equal about $2 million in 2022 money. So this is something more than just a nice plaque or even a nice Tiffany sword. This is a serious, serious contribution of money. The tactics were very similar to what Republican supporting officers had implemented in the episode I talked about just a few minutes ago, right? Where they called the regiments together and said, this is what we believe, is it not? Well, this was basically giving the Army this circular saying, you're going to contribute money to George McClellan, are you not? And they would actually record the names of all the soldiers who contributed and give the book to George McClellan as a testimonial of the love that the Army still held for their dear commander. So in this case, they would compile a black and white list of McClellan supporters in the Army of the Potomac. 2 Union generals right off the bat said no way. David Bell Birney in the 3rd Corps and Oliver Otis Howard commanding the 11th Corps. Both were Republicans. Both were anti-slavery men. Both found the West Point clique, as they would have called it, that ruled the Army of the Potomac to be incredibly frustrating. Of course, Howard was a West Pointer himself, but that's a little bit of a different story. Howard actually, in this period, was being groomed by the Republican Party in Maine to run for governor of that state while he was still serving in the Army of the Potomac. He turned it down, of course, and would serve with Sherman out west, but both of these guys forbade their corps from contributing to the McClellan testimonial. Some of the Army's Little Mac supporters, McClellan supporters, were horrified to learn that anyone would read politics into this. The men of the Army never thought of politics in connection with the thing, wrote a soldier in the 1st Massachusetts Light Artillery. Others were politically aware enough to know that this could be a powder keg, an incredible embarrassment for the Lincoln administration. An artillerist in the 6th New York Independent Battery wrote home, some soldiers hint that this testimonial, instead of lining General McClellan's pocket, goes into the exchequer of the opposition to overthrow the administration that deposed him. So just as they had that spring, individual regiments also gathered to voice their opposition. Regiments like the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, the 60th New York of George Sears Green's brigade in the 12th Corps, and the 119th Pennsylvania from the 6th Corps. Now, I found the original manuscripts of the 119th Pennsylvania's resolutions in the Civil War Library Museum of Philadelphia's archives. And you can see it on the left there, sort of written out in ink and then marked up in pencil to correct this or that. And then as it is published in the Philadelphia Press on September 30th, 1863. So the regiment drew up these resolutions denouncing not just the McClellan testimonial, but the whole idea of George McClellan, and then publishing that in the Philadelphia Press, right above the advertisement for Miss Julia Brooks's delicious blackberry cordial, as you can see there. We consider the movement as an ingenious political scheme, the 119th declared, designed for some other object, and that it'll be used by political demagogues as a weapon for the accomplishment of their unholy purposes. So that's some of the opposition, but probably the most important opposition to the McClellan testimonial came from this guy, Major General Carl Schurz, who commanded a division in the Union 11th Corps. Schurz kept his copy of the testimonial circular and sent it to his political patron, the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase from Ohio. Chase, in turn, ran over to the War Department and showed it to Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. I know it's hard to believe, but Stanton was really ticked off about this. And Stanton decided to halt the testimonial in its tracks. Within just a couple days of the administration learning of this, George Gordon Meade was recalled to Washington to talk, among other things, about sending a couple corps of the Army of the Potomac out west to help William Rosecrans, who was in a terrible situation down at Chattanooga. I have a feeling that's not all they talked about, though, because as soon as Meade got back to the Army, the testimonial was stopped, and all the money returned. Now, all of this might have been a rather insignificant affair, a footnote in a book on the Army of the Potomac, except for the fact that it happened right around the same time as gubernatorial elections and other state elections across the North in the fall of 1863. Especially in Maine, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where key Republicans were running against anti-war Democrats. Some of the toughest units in the Union Army gathered for yet more resolutions, including the Iron Brigade, which was furious at Wisconsin for toying with the idea of voting for Democrats. Dilger's Battery, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, and even the 20th Maine. Now, there's plenty of regimental histories about the 20th Maine. I haven't found one that talked about this yet. But the 20th Maine, drafted these resolutions in early September of 1863, saying that those back home had a solemn choice to make shameful or glorious forever the graves of the regiment's casualties at Little Round Top. But the most egregious candidate in the eyes of the Union Army was Clement Vallandigham, the leader of the Ohio Copperhead movement, and Democrats astonishingly nominated him for governor while he was in exile for political sedition. And as the Ohioans of Dilger's Battery put it, no duty would be more acceptable to us than that of punishing these cowardly traitors in the rear. But most eyes were on Pennsylvania. Here, where there was a particularly fierce fight between Andrew Curtin, the rather popular incumbent governor of the state, and George Woodward, the state Supreme Court Chief Justice, I think he was Chief Justice, who wrote the majority opinion that had once denied Pennsylvania soldiers the right to vote at the front. Soldiers' reaction was about as popular as you might imagine. They labeled him a traitor, they labeled him a copperhead, an enemy of the army. But the most consequential thing wasn't that Woodward was defeated in that election. Anybody following the election could have predicted that. It was that on election day, Woodward received a rather surprising endorsement in the Philadelphia press from George B. McClellan. McClellan, the man the Army had loved, endorsed Woodward in the press. The soldiers were aghast. It was as if Little Mac himself had hoisted this banner of treason. And in the words of some soldiers, he would have been physically unsafe visiting the Army that season. A soldier in the 59th New York wrote home to his sweetheart, "When Lincoln removed McClellan, we thought it was wrong because we worshipped him. But since, we have learned better." I'll talk about one more thing before I wrap up. And that is, of course, the election of 1864. Democrats felt McClellan was still their best choice to seize the soldier vote from Republicans in the 1864 presidential election. And as I'm sure you all know, Lincoln carried the soldier vote in 1864 by a huge margin. Did I just spoil the ending? I think I spoiled the ending. Soldiers from every northern state but two gave Lincoln at least 15 to 20% higher voter turnout than their state brethren back home. But instead of going through all that, I thought I'd highlight an aspect of the 1864 election that's never really been examined in great detail before, at least not in a long, long time. And that is how soldiers who chose not to re-enlist in 1864 participated in the political process back home. So how Army of the Potomac veterans during the war acted during the election. In late 1863, most of the Army of the Potomac grappled with this question of whether to re-enlist, because a good percentage of the Army had enlisted in late 1861 for 3 years, which meant they were going to be coming up for re-enlistment soon. They were due to be mustered out at some point in 1864, and they had to decide by basically the end of 1863 whether they were going to re-up, as it was called, or not. Now, many of those who fought with the Army at places like Gettysburg were simply too exhausted to continue the fight. If you read the letters of soldiers and discussing why they're not re-enlisting, generally speaking, there aren't that many soldiers who say, "I hate this war," or "I hate the direction the war is going in, I don't believe in it, so I'm getting out." Most of the time they're saying, "I have no idea how long this thing is going to go on, and I can't bear to tell my wife and kids that I've re-upped for the duration of this conflict. I am exhausted. I've been sick. Look at the pension files of Civil War soldiers if you don't believe me. And it's time to go home." So tens of thousands of soldiers took their honorable discharge over the course of the next several months. When it came time to hold the 1864 election, the Republican Party rebranded itself the National Union Party by bringing in some pro-war Democrats into the under the umbrella. For instance, nominating Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee, as Lincoln's running mate. So you might hear me slip up and call it the Republican Party, and a lot of historians do, but technically it's the National Union Party. The Democrats were all over the place. They decided to nominate George McClellan as their standard bearer. That wasn't all that surprising. But then they saddled George McClellan, who would have wanted some sort of victory over the Confederacy. They saddled him with a vice presidential candidate who had been a strident anti-war Democrat, George Pendleton. And the party and McClellan never really figured out how to make that marriage work. So the Democratic Party was fundamentally weakened by their own internal dynamics during the 1864 presidential campaign. Little Mac struggled to reconcile his natural wish to defeat the Confederacy on the battlefield, I think, with his own party's wish to strike a bargain with the Confederacy that would renegotiate emancipation. But to the point I raised, how did Union veterans on the home front, those who didn't re-enlist, who chose to go home in the middle of the war, how did they behave during the election? Thousands of veterans, men who had very recently been in the Union ranks but were now carrying scars with them as they reintegrated into daily life, mobilized to support their preferred candidate. It was a real case of Union veterans clashing with each other over politics. There were competing political clubs that popped up in most of the major cities across the North. These veterans marched in torchlight parades. If you know anything about politics in this period, you know that the political rally of the day was basically something called the Torchlight Parade. It tracked back to, I think, probably Jacksonian politics, but was really popularized in 1860 by the Wide Awakes, who were sort of like this Republican paramilitary organization of bodyguards that would go around with Lincoln, wearing sort of quasi-uniforms and carrying torches at night. Very intimidating stuff. That was, and it must have been absolutely fascinating to see. At the height of the campaign season, you'd see these hundreds of men outside at night carrying torches and holding up signs and luminaries proclaiming that their candidate was going to save the country and everything. But these competing political clubs popped up. So in New York, and also Boston, but mostly New York, this organization appeared called the Mcclellan Legion. And this was basically all of the Democrats in the Union Army who hadn't stayed with the Army by 1864. So men like Abram Duryea from the 5th New York Zouaves and J.H. Hobart Ward, who of course commanded a brigade here on the second day of the battle before, I think he was driven out of the Army for supposed drunkenness on May 12, 1864 at the Battle of Spotsylvania. But these guys headed the McClellan Legion, and they would meet at Delmonico's in New York and toast McClellan and organize campaign speeches and so forth to support McClellan, and you can see some of their literature there. But not to be outdone, Republican officers in New York sponsored something called the Veteran Union Club. Now, these guys probably look familiar as being essentially the tormentors of George Gordon Meade in the Army of the Potomac. Abner Doubleday, Republican. Daniel Butterfield, Republican. Daniel Sickles, who really just likes Daniel Sickles, but you might as well call him a Republican because even though he was a Democrat, he hated anti-war Democrats so much that well, anyway. So these three guys organized the Veteran Union Club, and they would meet at the Cooper Union in Manhattan and sponsor political speeches supporting Lincoln. And they invited speakers like Joseph Hooker and Ambrose Burnside and Lysander Cutler and some of these other officers from the Army to speak on behalf of the administration to the public. Then there was Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was wild as far as politics was concerned. It was really the epicenter of this stuff. So in Philadelphia, veteran organizations included more men at the junior and field grade officer level. So the McClellan Old Guard, as it was called, in Philadelphia, had guys like our friend Buck Mccandless, not surprisingly, who ran the thing. Charles Kokersberger and Richard Penn Smith, both of them from the Philadelphia Brigade here at Gettysburg. All three of these men were Gettysburg veterans. And so they would do similar things. They would organize torchlight parades, rallies, sponsor speeches, publish all sorts of resolutions and everything, proclaiming that George McClellan was going to be the savior of the Republic and the choice of any soldier who was true to his old commander. Republicans did the same thing. And you can see here a couple other Gettysburg veterans, DeWitt Clinton Baxter and Turner Moorhead of the Philadelphia Brigade. So the Philadelphia Brigade was sort of split right down the middle. Peter Elmacher of the 119th Pennsylvania and so on. The Soldiers Campaign Club was organized along basically the same lines that regiments and battalions and companies were organized in the Union Army. So they organized themselves. They would do drill. They would march in torchlight parades. And I think these pro-Lincoln clubs, especially this one, were really sort of an unheralded predecessor to the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization of the post-war years. And just as an example of how insidious the political divide could get, take the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves as an example. These are veterans from the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves who joined the Republican group, the Soldiers Campaign Club. You can see there a colonel, a major, and some other guys. And the McClellan Old Guard, another colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and some other junior officers. And caught right in the middle was the regiment's last commander, George Woodward, whose own father had run for governor of Pennsylvania the year before. It all sort of came to a head on October 29th during a rather brutal brawl in the streets of Philadelphia between Democratic veterans and Republican veterans. It was a Democratic Torchlight Parade the last week in October. And on the evening of October 29th, some Democratic veterans descended on the headquarters of the Soldiers Campaign Club, and standing guard outside the club was a veteran from the 29th Pennsylvania named Francis Fritz, who'd been wounded serving in the 12th Corps. Words were exchanged. Rocks and punches were thrown. Democratic soldiers ended up pummeling Fritz to the ground. And he lived just long enough to cast a vote for Lincoln before he returned to his sickbed and died the day after the election on November 9th. And his death shocked Republican veterans. They donned their Army of the Potomac uniforms to bury him after Lincoln's re-election. He said, "Boys, this is my last vote. That blow will be the death of me." Or at least that's what the newspapers said. So. And I'd be remiss if I didn't show you the regimental returns, such as I've managed to find them for the Army of the Potomac at the front in 1864. So these were the pro-McClellan regiments, or the regiments that gave a majority of their vote to George McClellan and the Democratic Party in 1864. And see if any of your favorite regiments are up there. These are the Lincoln regiments. These are the regiments that voiced their support for the National Union Party. We could talk all day about the differences between the Army of the Potomac in 1863 here at Gettysburg and the Union Army that voted in 1864. The big difference is about 50 to 60,000 casualties in those 6 weeks in the middle of 1864 that bled the old Army of the Potomac to death, the Army of the Potomac that had fought here at Gettysburg. So it was a very different army that voted in 1864. But even then, even after the ranks had been refilled with replacements and recruits, draftees and subsequent enlistees, these men by and large supported Lincoln overwhelmingly. In fact, of I think, 161 regiments that I managed to find, 164 regimental voting totals that I managed to locate, 130 went for the administration, with fully 71 regiments having given more than 3/4 of their vote to Honest Abe. And even more telling was the fact that the Army of the Potomac vote compared with the vote tally on the home front in some pretty impressive ways. So, for instance, from the state of Maine, soldiers at the front voted 24.6 points higher for Lincoln than civilians did back home. Only in 2 states were the vote totals for McClellan higher. New York, 0.6 points higher, and Vermont, 2.7 points higher. All right. The reality then, to bring it to a close, is that the Army of the Potomac, the very same field army that had once been George McClellan's, that had once loved George McClellan, that had even once threatened, or at least elements within it, threatened to raise their voice against the administration over McClellan's removal, rebuffed the Democratic Party, rebuffed McClellan, and helped win the war as much by voting at the front as by fighting against the rebellion. And to bring it full circle, what the Army of the Potomac won through its share of the vote and its share of the fighting was a Union restored, however imperfect, and a system of slavery eventually destroyed with treason's surrender. And from my perspective, the most articulate writer and political thinker in the Army was James C. Rice, who you will recall from the beginning wrote encouragement to Lincoln in the war's darkest hour. And upon assuming command of the 44th New York, he wrote, "I believe that it's God's divine purpose, having used the wrath of the South to commence this war, to cause that wrath to praise him by the freedom of every slave. And I also confidently believe that this war under his providence will be made just severe enough to effect this object, and that it will be ended by God only when we as individuals, both North and South, shall see and realize this divine object. Be assured that in this war there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we will." Rice, of course, died of wounds received attacking Confederate lines at Laurel Hill on May 10th, 1864, and I want to dedicate the presentation here at Gettysburg to his sacrifice. So thank you for coming out today, and I will be happy to take whatever questions you have. And a disclaimer that the views in all this are mine and not the Department of Defense's. So there's that too. Any questions? Yes, Wayne, go ahead.
Zach, I'd like, a few years ago, author William Marvel came out with what I thought was an excellent book on Edwin Stanton called Lincoln's Autocrat. And one of the things he mentioned in that book, which I'd not heard of, is that Stanton manipulated the system by allowing the adjutant general to have the governors call regiments that could go on furlough back home to vote. And I had never heard, did you find evidence of this kind? And this was manipulation even down to the district level to look for regiments that had Republican votes in them and allow the colonels to allow them to have the soldiers that they knew were Republicans go back to the state and vote. I had never heard, but I mean, that's manipulation down to the very basic level. Did you find that? Really?
Yep. Yeah, it happened. And it happened primarily, I found, in 1863. In the spring 1863 elections in New England, I can't remember, was it New Hampshire and Connecticut, I want to say, had elections in the spring of 1863, and maybe a little bit in the autumn of 1863 with the gubernatorial elections. But this was a way, as far as, I guess, Stanton, according to Marvel, but also other officers in the Army, like Joseph Hooker. I mean, I don't think Joseph Hooker was blind to this fact. I think he probably facilitated it. But this was a way to get around what Republicans thought was a conspiracy on the part of Democrats in the first place to disenfranchise soldiers. In other words, if the soldiers would just have been able to vote at the front, they wouldn't have had to go home on furlough to vote. But as it was, Stanton, Hooker, and others at least wanted to prioritize those soldiers who would vote to sustain the Republican Party or the administration. Yeah, it absolutely happened. Good question.
I just want to say, Doctor, that was an excellent presentation. You could see how much research you put into it. It was fascinating how you compared the political climate then, of course, very timely for the political climate today.
Try to steer clear of political implications for today, but it does happen.
Great job, Doctor.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know your focus here was the Army of the Potomac, but do you think some of these similar things that you found happened in, say, the Army of the Cumberland, Army of Tennessee?
Yep.
Similar?
Yep. I when I was done with this project, I thought about turning my eye to those other armies just to see what that experience would be like. And in essence, I realized I'd be writing the same book. The Army of the Cumberland did exactly the same thing. And in fact, the Army of the Cumberland, I think, because so much more of the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Tennessee, because those armies were so much more heavily Midwestern, where the Copperheads were really a political force, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, there was at least as much attention in the camps given to the political problems back home as there was in the Army of the Potomac. And in April of 1863, William Stark Rosecrans, who commanded the Army of the Cumberland, took the unprecedented step of publishing his own op-ed in an Ohio newspaper, I think, denouncing the Copperheads back home, something that even Joseph Hooker, who was about as Republican as any commander got in the Army of the Potomac, didn't do. So yeah, the short answer to your question is absolutely there is that sort of thing. Sir?
Did you find any indication of some of these junior officers writing to the Joint Committee of the conduct of the war?
I don't want to answer before I've gone through my catalog in my mind, but I don't think that I definitely saw junior officers reacting to it, but I didn't see indications of junior officers writing. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if they did. I really wouldn't. Many of these junior officers were politically aware enough to know who the friendliest forces were in Washington. And as far as rooting out Copperheadism within the Army was concerned, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, that was its primary purpose, we'll be honest. But they were definitely reacting. So when the Joint Committee would publish its reports, the junior officers would read them from the Associated Press and comment on them in their diaries and so forth. Haven't seen any indications of them writing directly, but I would have to look, and you've piqued my interest, so thank you. Good question. Yes, please.
So when you talked about the resolutions that were written by the junior officers presented to the regiments, and then they made their donations, this is a political contribution to McClellan, is that correct? His campaign?
It was unclear.
Okay.
It was unclear. I suspect that Meade and others, genuinely wanted to present McClellan with some rather significant cash sum, or just a sword in addition to a cash sum, as sort of a no hard feelings little Mac. But the more cynical in the Army definitely suspected that it was being there was basically going to be some money laundering, and it was going to end up in the Democratic Party.
When they made that contribution, they didn't really know what it was going.
Not exactly, no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Well, again, folks, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. I will remind you that tomorrow, Sunday, at 1:30, weather permitting, we'll continue our winter lecture series with Ranger Carlton Smith, who will be looking at the Scout Harrison on the staff of James Longstreet. If you can't be here in person, just as a reminder, these are all live streamed onto our YouTube channel where you can access them later. And then finally, one last thank you to Dr. Zachary Fry.
Thank you.
Thank you all.